One of the things I think I'll say straight off the bat now is that I'm not a mentor this year, so I don't actually currently have a live StepLab login. And also, if there are any changes to what I'm about to present to you, I apologise in advance because I know that they've made some tweaks. Anyway, I'm here this afternoon just to kind of take you through what I did, just to see if that's obviously of any use to you. Obviously, I don't want to waste your time, and I'll make this as quick as possible. But now I'm just going to go through what I did and how I maybe knocked the corners off myself, because I'm quite, I don't know, fastidious, I suppose is a good word, and I like to all my I's dotted and my T's crossed. And it was just something that I just wanted to make sure that I was doing all the things I should be doing, and obviously doing right by my ECT and giving them the training they deserved and so on. So hopefully, just give me a Y, please, in the chat if you can see this PowerPoint slide, and I will take you through my presentation, just talking about how I did it last year. So give me a Y in the chat, please. Give me a Y to see that you're ready to go. Like I said, this is not me forcing my way on you or anything. It's just how it worked for me. And like I said, I wanted to get things right. So here we go. So the first one really was, you've got to think about your weekly observe, feedback, mentor cycle. So it's really, really important to get that in place early on. I do realise that in some schools across the network that it's more difficult. I was quite fortunate. I was able to find free periods that I could share with my ECT. I was able to spend the time with them. And I know some of you are very, very busy and you don't get that. But if you can at all possible, wrangle with your leaders and your departments and things, and try to get yourself a really firm observe, feedback, mentor cycle going really early on, so that it's just, it's just instinctive. Every single week, it's the same sort of, or every 2-week cycle if you've got a 2-week timetable. So the first thing really is to kind of observe your ECT. You'll have had a chat with them and you'll have talked about the kind of thing that you want to observe them on. And so you can see on the feedbacks on the slide on the screen, it says observe your ECT. And what I did when I was in my observation is, rather than writing anything down with a pencil and a piece of paper or something, I tried to do everything on my laptop. Now, I know this is not everybody's got a laptop access, but if you could borrow a laptop, it is really, really useful, because you can sit there on the wireless Wi-Fi and you can get it all done there and then. It's really, really important. Now, it says on the on StepLab that a 15-minute observation is sufficient. Now, I never found that. I found that I needed longer because, of course, I was typing things live. I was doing everything as it was happening. And usually the time it took me in a lesson to get a decent observation and write some decent feedback down, think of some good questions that I could ask my ECT, I was in a lesson for a good 25 minutes. So again, that will vary from school to school, how long your lessons are and so on. But 15 minutes, don't believe the hype, the 15 minutes. It's just a guidance, and you could go in and see exactly what you want to see within 5-10 minutes and then be spending 5 minutes typing it up. But it took longer for me. It took longer for me to get a good quality observation written down. So I would go into the classroom, I would sit myself in a reasonable place so that I could observe my ECT and obviously observe what the children are doing as well. And so during the observation, you have your series of targets that the ECT has to meet, and you can see that on the screen there. The series of kind of targets, so basically on StepLab, as you go through them, you toggle them to say that they've met them. What I did later in the year, just so that you know, later in the year, there were some things that I didn't directly observe with my ECT in that particular lesson, but I knew that he'd been doing them in previous lessons. And so I toggled them anyway. I don't think there's, it needs to be really, really hard and fast about when you're seeing them. But I was pulling the little toggle things across if I'd seen some evidence and I'd recorded some evidence sometime in the past that he had actually done those things. So it feels quite artificial that you've got these set of things to look at. And one of the things that I found was that obviously I had to go into the lesson at the right time to see these things. So this is why sometimes it took 25 minutes, half an hour to be sitting in the lesson waiting for this evidence to kind of present itself with the ECT showing that they can meet these certain criteria. So I would completely understand if anybody was sitting there thinking it feels like a straitjacket and I'm looking at these, these definite list of things. It can feel like that sometimes, but I think we, as mentors, we've got to give ourselves a break and we've got to look at the big picture. And there are lots and lots of things going on, little tiny targets that we're talking about with our ECTs and so on. I know that this is designed to be very specific and you'd be looking at that and feeding back on that. But in reality, what we all know is that, teachers are working on lots of things in the background, things that run concurrent to the targets they're there. It's a bit like kind of going on a driving lesson and expecting someone to only use the steering wheel. It's kind of a bit of nonsense, but we are looking for those particular things and finding evidence that the ECTs are actually competent in those things. So I would sit there in the observation. I would write down some things about the points, the positive points in the observation. Make sure you write lots of positives. This was really good. I saw you doing this. Obviously, try and link it to the targets that they've set for that particular lesson. Make it as relevant as possible. It doesn't have to be lots and lots and lots of text, but if it was something that my ECT was doing really, really well and I wanted to, highlight and say, oh, really good how you got them in today, and the target's nothing about that, I put that in as well anyway, because I think it was important for the ECT to know that they're kind of on the right track. So then you've got a question where you are, a key question that encapsulates the focus and that's going to move your conversation on. And you've got kind of 1/2 questions to edit in there. And I found that I did this every single time. It gives you a generic question, which usually ends with that will improve student learning. And so I would pick things that would always end in that, because obviously that's the focus of what we're trying to do as teachers. So I recorded praise. You can see there's a sample, a screenshot I've taken of the ECT that I had last year. So the things that I felt that he was doing well, tried to make it as focused as possible to be, congruent with the targets that we'd set. But, if there were other things there that warranted saying, I put them in as well. And there's a little thing I think that you can do now. It came in the summer of this past year, where you can give a shout out, which means that it kind of publicly puts it on everybody's StepLab, and other ECTs and mentors can see that John Smith has had a really good lesson and so on and so forth. And they're quite nice, and the ECT, public recognition of the ECT's good work. Now, after recording that praise, you've got to decide on the next step. So you've got to look for evidence for the next steps. So what did I see in that lesson that's going to inform the next step that the ECT is going to make? Now, this is the bit where I didn't so much as cheat, but I used StepLab in order to make it workable. Okay, so deciding on the next step and trying to find out what sort of thing they should be aiming for. What I would do is I would sit in the lesson, I'd click on this. You can see on the screen now where it says deciding on the next step. It says the embracing error. So I looked through and I found something that I thought, yeah, that's something that that my ECT can be doing. And so I clicked on that, and then you have to go you click on a focus on an appropriate type within that. So like a subsection of embracing error, and you can see there's a bunch of different, slightly different targets there on the zoom in section. And so then I would look at those and I think, how does that kind of relate to what he's doing in this lesson or maybe last lesson? And then from that, you would then select one of those particular zoom in bits, and then that expands to these little things with a step icon next to them, showing you that this is their next step. And then, of course, you have to select an appropriate target to focus on for the next lesson. And so what I did was I did this at the same time that I was filling in evidence for this target. So I'm going to say that again so people aren't confused. So if I filled in the box which said the evidence for the next steps are this, and then I went to the next steps and started looking for an appropriate step, it's harder to do it that way. So what I did is I went to the next steps and I looked at what the next steps were, and then I tailored my evaluative evidence that informed the next step to that, if you see what I mean. So I kind of, worked kind of semi backwards, backwards and forwards between these two things. And I found that that worked really, really well. Because if I decided on, well, he's got to work on this, and then I'm sitting in the lesson searching through all these next steps and these next targets, I just got myself in a muddle. So I would go and I would look at the next set of steps, and I would choose from those which I think was appropriate for my ECT. Then I would go back and fill in the evidence box with the text box for the evidence in the lesson that led to the next step. So like I said, I was kind of doing it backwards, but it made it easier, and it didn't detract from the journey that the ECT took. It wasn't doing it backwards and cheating so much. It was just trying to make the system workable. I hope that makes sense to people. And what you'll do is when you'll sit in lessons and you do these observations, you will be looking through these next appropriate targets, and there'll be some times where you'll look at the list of targets and you'll say to yourself, none of these seem appropriate, because he or she has done this, or they have done this a couple of weeks ago, kind of thing, and it's quite difficult to select those targets. And I know that some mentors found that very restrictive, and they kind of only had a certain thing to choose from, and some people would argue, well, that's not where my mentee is at the moment, that's not where my ECT is at the moment, they've mastered that, they've moved on from this sort of thing. But I think at the end of the day, you've got to realise that the StepLab is just a way of recording evidence and making sure that the ECTs are taking a generic route through their training. And so I told myself not to get too hung up on the fact that I couldn't record all the evidence for all the things they were doing, for all the targets they were meeting, all the time, because it's very limited. You've got this set of targets which you need to kind of use and move on. So kind of roll with it. Yes, Danny.
I just want to come in there as well. I'm really glad you touched on that, and I put it in the chat actually before you mentioned it. So the biggest feedback that we received last year was from kind of induction leads and mentors saying, my ECT, really needs to kind of focus on other areas that's not necessarily under the strand that we're working on. So again, just to kind of echo what Chris says, maybe for the first few weeks, certainly, please just try to focus on that strand and on the kind of, the things that you're seeing around that particular strand, because it is just so important that the kind of point behind this is that national standard that we're trying to set. And obviously where, some schools will do it one way, other schools will then take another approach. And it really is just trying to get all ECTs at that kind of national standard. So as much as you could kind of be on board and behind that as possible, that would be great. In year 2, it becomes a little bit more flexible, where you then as the mentor have the a bit more autonomy to go back and say, right, actually, we need to focus on this area because you really weren't great at that last year. But for this year, certainly, it's about following that curriculum as much as possible. Hopefully, I've explained that clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but that alongside that, I think we need to trust ourselves as professionals to do the right thing by our ACTs. I think one of the reasons why this format has developed is that some ECTs weren't getting a very good deal, if we're honest with ourselves, and we obviously want to keep people in the profession and train up high quality staff. So we also need, alongside, we need to trust ourselves that if we are doing lots of other stuff in the background, well, that's great, and the ECT is going to benefit from that. But to, as Danny said, to kind of stick to this curriculum, that's probably the best word for it. So then I would go to this particular step that I've chosen for my ECT, and that would obviously give me the things that I'd be tagging off in the next lesson, and I would think about those things about what I would say to my ECT in my up and coming mentor session. And then, of course, you decide when you do your feedback form how you're best going to model this in a mentor session. Now, you'll see in the videos that go alongside on StepLab that there's modelling, there's standing at the front in front of an empty classroom and asking pretend children questions and those sorts of things. And that's obviously one part of the modelling. And the ECTs need to go through that process, although some of them find it a bit kind of embarrassing. But standing up there and actually doing it, and then us being able to discuss it, is a really good thing to do. But it doesn't always have to be like that. It can be, for example, you can see the example I've put up on the screen there for you, where I asked my ECT to design an activity that he felt was challenging enough for me. So choose something outside of my specialism. I'm a science teacher by trade, so choose something outside of my specialism and try to pitch it so that it's about right for me, and then question me and lead me through the work and so on, in line with those targets that he's going to be doing. So he had a real experience of what it might feel like to do that. And of course, all the time I was responding as if I was a student and making notes about the sorts of things of which he could hone his practice and make it better, and questions, those key questions you need to ask your trainee about how the students are going to progress through the work if you get asked those certain sorts of questions. So modelling doesn't always have to be standing at the front of the classroom. I think there was again a misconception where people felt they had to stand in front of a whiteboard and pretend to teach, and that was modelling. It doesn't have to be. It can be modelling planning a lesson. It can be modelling anything, how a PowerPoint is put together and how that's used, those sorts of things. And of course, the other thing that you've got to make sure you're on top of, and that is that your ECT is watching their videos and they're doing their Learn section of StepLab. So every week they've got a certain module, certain unit to cover, and it shows you when they've seen it. My ECT got into the habit of doing it on a Saturday morning. So therefore, when I kind of came in had a little look on a Sunday or a Monday morning, because I would see him Monday afternoon, I could see whether he'd done his video, and I would make sure that I watched the video. Sometimes I watched the video at 1.5 speed when I needed to, and to have some sort of things up your sleeve where you are talking to your ECT about the video they've watched, because it's quite easy to flick through them and click on done, and we obviously want to make sure they're getting the best deal and that they are actually going through the units and thinking about the things that are on the video that they've been asked to look at. So just a little word, obviously some will rush through it, others will take it diligently and make notes, but just bear in mind that obviously each person's different, and it's always best to have some little questions just kind of up your sleeve to ask your ECT, just to make sure they're engaging with the material. It's really important that they do. And then, of course, planning your feedback questions. I always limited myself to 2 feedback questions. I tried to kind of percolate down and condense down everything that I'd seen to something that was relevant, obviously, to the targets, but also relevant to the next set of targets. So there was a nice segue. It kind of led on nicely to the next set of targets. So it wasn't just something completely different. Again, they're kind of generic things there, but I would always edit them and make them personal to the ECT. Okay, and then of course that then takes you back to the observation being complete, which it tags you, as you can see on the left-hand side there, that you've done an observation complete. And then of course the feedback's due. I would always try to do my feedback within a day or so, try to do it on the same day, even if it was 10 minutes of feedback, and I would sometimes do a screenshot of my feedback and email it to my ECT so they could have a little read of it and maybe ask me questions about it. But I tried to get feedback on their lesson to them as soon as I possibly could, and obviously that depends on your your timetable and so on. But the sooner they get the feedback, the sooner kind of it means something to them. And then of course what I would do at my mental session is I would then recap the feedback really quite rapidly and say, right, well, you remember last time this was the feedback, you did this, so that it refreshed their memory, because of course the there would be a bit of time elapsed between the feedback and the mentor session, just to keep everything fresh. I don't think I've got much to say about this. Yeah, it was just kind of the next step. And so, you know, part of the feedback is saying, well, this is the sort of thing we're going to be doing next. And so I would set my ECT like a task to do or something to prepare in advance. I found that he wasn't very good on planning something on the hoof. So when you got to a mentor session, it's always best for them to have at least thinking about what you're going to do, what you're going to model, the things you're going to talk to them about. So, for example, in this one, I've kind of given some notes here about what I'd like him to do for the next time. It's always nice to kind of prepare in advance and for them to have their feedback in writing. It's not until you actually feedback, it doesn't send them the feedback on StepLab. So that is why I copied and pasted it into the body of an email and sent it to him personally. They may have changed that on StepLab, I don't know, this year, but that was something I found awkward. Until I'd actually fed back to him in my mentor session, he didn't get sent a copy of the feedback and the questions and so on. So I'd take a copy of it, screenshot or copy and paste it and send it to him on an email so that he had it, you know, within 24 hours. So my last thing really, we've got about 7 minutes left and I wanted sort of 5 minutes for questions, so that's about right. So the workflow, beg your pardon, that worked for me was that I met with my ECT. We put an hour aside for that. I did mine after school just because it was the most convenient for me. Decided on an area of focus, discussed it, modelled it, practiced it. Sometimes practiced it more than once. It will always prompt you to say, you've only practiced this once. Do you want to practice it again? And sometimes it's completely appropriate to do it more than once, other times it isn't. So again, that's something you should trust yourself on. Set a date for the observation. We would always try to work within those sort of 3 or 4 classes, and obviously I would try to get in there when I could, have a variety of classes, but I did tend to keep going to see the class that he had the most problems with. Now, that was really useful because he really had to think that through, because you know that was his top priority. So but obviously there's no harm in going and seeing another class, but he was very anxious to kind of get better, and he would deliberately invite me along to classes where he's saying, you know, I have difficulty quietening them down at the beginning, I've difficulty, you know, having a plenary at the end, sort of thing. Could you come and help me out with that? So hopefully your ECT is up for it like that. And then, of course, go and observe. I put approximately 30 to 40 minutes. They do say 15 minutes, and of course, there's nothing wrong with 15 minutes, but I found it difficult to sit there and really be attentive about what was happening and type it all up and be ready at the end of that particular observation with everything typed into StepLab, ready to feed back. I think it's very, very worthwhile. We've got so little time that, you know, use that time in the lesson to kind of get it done so that you can shut your laptop and walk out and you know that it's all ready and set up for the feedback. And then, of course, the feedback face-to-face within a day or two, doing it briefly, even if it was 10 minutes at the end of the day, or, you know, I'd meet him on duty and I'd talk him through something, and then either screenshot or copy and paste my notes that I'd made so that he can see them and think about them. And then around we go again. And then so we meet with the ECT in the mentor session, decide an area for focus, discuss model and practice, and round it goes every week. Something I was very, very keen on doing was making sure I stuck to it. It was kind of a sacrosanct time in my week where I would move other things not to get in the way. Obviously, there were some times when it was unavoidable. But, you know, getting the ECT into that regular, we're meeting, we're observing, we're feeding back, you're going home and you're doing your study, your learn part of StepLab, and then you're coming back the next week and round we go again. And, you know, routines, obviously, as we all know, are very, very important. And I think the ECTs do appreciate that because they know where they are. There's nothing worse than the ECT getting their mentor session cancelled over and over again and, you know, getting disillusioned about the support they're receiving. Okay, Danny, I think that's about it for me. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I've just transferred to my mobile. No, that's all. I didn't want to keep people too long. If anybody has any questions and they just want to stay on the call to speak to Chris for a few minutes at the end, feel free. Thank you so much for giving up your time, but please get in contact with us if you start using StepLab and still haven't got a clue. It does take a bit of getting, used to, a bit of playing around with, but once you do, I'm confident that you will be fine with it. So yeah, give us a shout if you need anything. Oh, you're muted, Chris. Chris, you're muted. Didn't hear any of that.
Sorry. So I've put my email address in the chat down there, and email me if you need any help. If you want to spend 5-10 minutes on Teams. I had a few people last year who appreciated, just getting in and pulling their hair out and being able to say, this is really winding me up, etc. And so we could talk it through. So it's worthwhile chatting to people. If you're the only person in your school doing it, obviously reach out to us and we'll help where we can. Jenna.
Just quickly, your next session that you've got booked in to support, is it a repeat of this just to pick up?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's just so that people can access it if they can't make today. And obviously it was no worries. It was next Monday, but of course other things are happening next Monday, so we moved it to Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, no worries, everyone. Like I said, if you do want to get in touch, reach out, then I'm more than happy to help. No worries. Have a good evening.